Imagine a man standing on the deck of a stolen frigate, his silhouette framed by a thick, oily cloud of black smoke that seems to pour directly from his head. He isn't a demon, though he desperately wants you to think he is. Tucked under his wide-brimmed hat are slow-burning hemp fuses, the kind used to ignite the massive cannons below deck, sparking and hissing against his cheeks as they drench his face in a hellish flickering light. Across his chest, he wears a heavy silk sling holding 6 loaded pistols, their brass fittings catching the salt-sprayed sun. He doesn't want to fight you. He wants you to be so paralyzed by the sight of him that you hand over your gold and your cargo without a single shot being fired. This was Edward Thatch, better known to history as Blackbeard, a man who understood the power of a brand centuries before the concept existed. He wasn't just a sailor or a thief. He was a psychological architect who built a kingdom of fear in the lawless gaps between empires. But beneath the smoke and the fury was a calculated political actor who was eventually hunted down not because he was a monster, but because he became a liability to the very men who profited from his crimes. In this investigation, we are stripping away the Hollywood makeup to find the real Edward Thatch. We are going deep into the shadows of the golden age of piracy to uncover how a common sailor navigated the cutthroat politics of the British Empire. This is a story of betrayals, backroom deals, and a final bloody stand in the shallow waters of the American coast. If you're into stories that peel back the layers of legendary figures to reveal the gritty, political reality beneath, you'll want to join us as we explore the rise and fall of the man who turned the Atlantic into his personal hunting ground. To understand why Blackbeard became the titan he was, you have to understand the world that created him. The early 1700s was a period of absolute chaos on the high seas. The European powers, Britain, France, and Spain, had been locked in a brutal conflict known as Queen Anne's War. For over a decade, the British Crown had encouraged private sailors to act as privateers, essentially legal pirates who were given letters of marque to attack enemy ships and keep a portion of the loot. But when the war ended in 1713, thousands of these men were suddenly stripped of their legal status. They were discarded by an empire that no longer needed them, left with no pay, no pension, and a set of skills that made them the most dangerous men on the planet. Edward Thatch was one of these men. While his early life remains shrouded in mystery, some records suggest he was a literate, well-to-do sailor from Bristol, while others place him in Jamaica. His entry into piracy was a direct response to the economic abandonment of the working-class sailor. But here's the thing that most people miss about the pirates of this era. They weren't just rebels. They were forming a new kind of society. In the Caribbean, specifically in the ruins of Nassau, these men founded what historians now call the Republic of Pirates. It was a rough, democratic experiment where captains were elected, loot was divided fairly, and there was even a form of health insurance for sailors who lost limbs in battle. Blackbeard didn't just join this world, he mastered it. He started as an apprentice to a veteran pirate named Benjamin Hornigold, but it quickly became clear that Thatch had a vision that went far beyond simple theft. He realized that the most valuable resource in the Atlantic wasn't gold or rum. It was reputation. In late 1717, Thatch made the move that would define his career. He captured a massive French slave ship called La Concorde off the coast of St. Vincent. Instead of just looting it and moving on, he saw its potential as a mobile fortress. He refitted the vessel with 40 cannons, an incredible amount of firepower for a pirate ship, and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. The name itself was a political jab, a nod to the war and the monarch that had abandoned men like him. With this ship, Blackbeard wasn't just a predator, he was an apex predator. He could outrun the fast Navy sloops and outgun the heavy merchantmen. He had created a weapon of war that made him the de facto king of the Caribbean. But Blackbeard's true genius lay in his theater of power. He knew that every time he engaged in a real battle, he risked losing men, losing masts, and losing profit. So, he crafted the persona of the devil himself. He grew his beard long, braiding it into pigtails tied with ribbons, and practiced the art of the terrifying entrance. There are almost no historical records of Blackbeard actually murdering prisoners or torturing victims before his final year. He didn't have to. The image of the smoking, pistol-strapped giant was enough. He was a master of psychological warfare, using fear as an economic tool to bypass the need for actual violence. This leads us to the most audacious moment of his career, the blockade of Charleston. In May 1718, Blackbeard didn't just sneak into a harbor to steal a ship. He parked the Queen Anne's Revenge and a fleet of smaller vessels right in the mouth of the busiest port in South Carolina. For 6 days, he held the entire city hostage. He seized every ship that tried to enter or leave, taking prominent citizens as prisoners. But he didn't ask for a chest of gold or a ship full of silver. He asked for a chest of medicine. His crew was ravaged by syphilis and other tropical diseases, and he knew the city had the supplies he needed. It was a move of pure political theater, proving that a pirate could bring a colonial capital to its knees. It was also a sign that he was becoming too big for the British Empire to ignore. After the Charleston blockade, Blackbeard made a move that still puzzles historians today. He sailed north to North Carolina and deliberately ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground on a sandbar. Some argue it was an accident, but many believe it was a cold-blooded downsizing. By wrecking his flagship and another vessel, he was able to ditch the majority of his crew, hundreds of men who were now a liability, and keep the lion's share of the treasure for himself and a small circle of loyalists. He then walked into the town of Bath and accepted a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden. This is where the story shifts from a high-seas adventure into a political thriller. Governor Eden was the head of a struggling, impoverished colony, and Blackbeard represented an unofficial economic stimulus package. The two men entered into what many believe was a corrupt partnership. Blackbeard would bring in salvaged goods, sugar, cocoa, cloth, and sell them to the locals at a discount, with Eden taking a cut of the profits. Blackbeard even built a house in Bath and reportedly married a local 16-year-old girl, the daughter of a planter. To the people of North Carolina, he wasn't a monster. He was a celebrity and a provider of cheap goods. He was living the life of a pseudo-aristocrat, protected by the very law that should have been hanging him. But while things were cozy in North Carolina, the neighboring governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, was watching with growing fury. Spotswood was a hardline imperialist and a man of immense ambition. He saw the presence of a pirate retirement home next door as a direct threat to British trade, and more importantly, a slap in the face to his own authority. Spotswood was convinced that Blackbeard was using his pardon as a front to continue his piracy, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Blackbeard was still heading out to sea, finding abandoned ships and bringing them back to Bath. Spotswood decided that if the governor of North Carolina wouldn't act, he would. However, Spotswood had no legal right to invade a neighboring colony. Doing so was a massive breach of colonial law and an insult to the British Crown's administrative boundaries. But Spotswood was a man who preferred to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. He used his own personal funds to bypass the Virginia legislature and hired two small civilian sloops, the Jane and the Ranger. He couldn't use heavy Navy ships because the waters of North Carolina were too shallow and treacherous. He needed a surgical strike. He put these ships under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a man known for his discipline and his unwavering commitment to the mission. This was essentially an illegal black op, a secret military strike designed to eliminate a political problem. As Maynard's sloops began their slow crawl toward the Ocracoke Inlet, Blackbeard was anchored in a state of relative relaxation. He had spent the night before the battle drinking with his crew and a group of local traders. He knew the British were looking for him, but he felt untouchable behind his pardon and his shallow water defenses. But that's where things get strange. There are reports that Blackbeard was warned that Maynard was coming, yet he chose to stay and drink. Some suggest he was tired of the life, while others think he simply overestimated his own legend. He believed the treacherous sandbars of Ocracoke would do his fighting for him. On the morning of November 22, 1718, the two forces finally met. Because there was no wind, Maynard's men had to row their sloops toward Blackbeard's ship, the Adventure. As they approached, Blackbeard stood at the rail and shouted a defiant oath, promising that he would give no quarter and take none. He then unleashed a devastating broadside of grape shot, nails, scrap metal, and glass that ripped through Maynard's ships. The carnage was instant. The deck of the Ranger was turned into a slaughterhouse, and Maynard's own ship, the Jane, lost nearly half its men in seconds. To Blackbeard, it looked like a total victory, but Maynard was a master of the double cross. He ordered his remaining men to hide below deck, leaving only himself and the pilot visible. He wanted Blackbeard to think the ship was a floating tomb, an easy prize for the taking. It worked. Blackbeard, seeing the empty decks, ordered his men to board and finish the job. As the pirates leaped onto the Jane, Maynard's men surged out of the hold like ghosts from the grave. The battle turned from a naval engagement into a frantic, close-quarters bloodbath. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, salt, and raw iron. The climax of the fight was a direct duel between the lieutenant and the legend. Maynard and Blackbeard stood face to face on the blood-slicked deck. They both fired their pistols at the same time. Maynard's shot hit home, but Blackbeard, fueled by adrenaline and perhaps his own myth, didn't even flinch. He swung his massive cutlass with such force that he snapped Maynard's sword in half. As Blackbeard raised his blade for the killing blow, one of Maynard's men, a Highlander, stepped in and slashed Thatch across the throat. But even then, he didn't fall. The physical resilience of Blackbeard in those final minutes is one of the most well-documented feats in maritime history. He continued to fight, fending off multiple attackers, while blood poured from his neck. It took 5 gunshot wounds and 20 severe sword cuts to finally bring him down. He died while in the act of cocking a pistol for one last shot. The man who had spent his life cultivating the image of an immortal demon proved to be very mortal, but his end was every bit as violent as the legend he had created. After the battle, Maynard had Blackbeard's head severed and tied to the bowsprit of his ship as a trophy and as proof for the bounty. The body was thrown into the Ocracoke Inlet, and legend says it swam around the ship 3 times before finally sinking into the dark water. When Maynard sailed back into Virginia with the head of the world's most feared pirate dripping salt water from his hull, he wasn't just bringing a trophy. He was bringing proof that the age of the Pirate Republic was dead. The British Empire was no longer willing to tolerate the useful pirates who had helped build its colonies. It was now a global power that demanded total, regulated order. But the story didn't end with the death of the man. The fallout was a political firestorm. Governor Spotswood faced intense criticism for his illegal invasion of North Carolina, and the trial of Blackbeard's surviving crew members revealed the deep corruption within the colonial government. One of the crewmen, a black man known as Black Caesar, became a legend in his own right, representing the thousands of formerly enslaved people who found a twisted form of freedom under the black flag. The investigation into Blackbeard's affairs led all the way back to the governor's mansion in Bath, proving that the pirate hadn't been an outlier, but a vital, if hidden, gear in the machinery of the colonial economy. Blackbeard's death marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of piracy. Within a few years, the British Navy had swept the Caribbean and the American coast, hanging hundreds of pirates and turning the ocean into a safe highway for the empire's goods. The freedom of the pirate life was replaced by the rigid, brutal discipline of the merchant marine and the Royal Navy. The rebellion was over, and the corporation had won. If this look into the calculated madness and political execution of history's most famous pirate gave you a new perspective on the Golden Age, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the empires of the past. Edward Thatch was never the mindless monster the propaganda made him out to be. He was a man who understood that in a world governed by distant kings and corrupt governors, a terrifying mask was the only thing that could keep you free. He played the game of power with a flair that has never been matched, but he forgot the most important rule of the Atlantic. Eventually, the empire always stops laughing. He remains a symbol of that brief, flickering moment when a common sailor could terrify a kingdom just by lighting a few fuses and refusing to back down. Does his story represent a fight for freedom, or just a more honest form of the same greed that drove the empires themselves? That's a question that still haunts the waters of Ocracoke today.